All right, everybody, good evening to you all. It is 6:30, time for us to begin. Open your Bibles, please, to the book of Revelation, chapter 14. Revelation, chapter 14. Glad you're here tonight. We have bad weather that's, I'm sure, keeping some people away, cold and rainy. You'll have to forgive me. You can probably hear it already. I sound like I'm doing a bad Clint Eastwood impersonation. It's not intentional, but it's just some sinus problems that I'm dealing with. So I have these little, those cherry lozenges things, those cherry things. As a kid, you eat them like candy. Well, as an adult, you eat them like candy too. So I'll probably knock down a couple of those before I'm done. So my voice might not be as, manic as it usually is. I may not be as exuberant as I usually am, but we'll definitely make the chapter come alive as best we can. Just as a refresher, can everybody hear me okay? I feel like I'm subdued, which might be good for y'all. It didn't get too loud maybe. Just as a refresher, just to lead up to chapter 14 where we're starting, it's almost like a mini climax to a section of the book. Chapter 12, we were introduced to, if you remember, the great constellation in the sky, and John witnessed a woman who was travailing to give birth, and then there was a great dragon to consume, at least that was the plan of the dragon, to consume the child. And that whole chapter, the way we looked at it, the way we understood it, is meant to be kind of a picture of the devil's pursuit against the church of Jesus Christ and his attempts to destroy that which is brought into the world through Christ. And then in the next chapter, chapter 13, we looked at these two great beasts. One came out of the sea, one came out of the land. One which was subservient to the other or did the bidding of the other, but both which had the same agenda, which is to destroy the kingdom of Jesus Christ in whatever way, shape, or form it could. And how that beast is the constant antagonist in this whole play, if you will. This is the villain of the story, if you're thinking of it in those terms, though this is very much a real story. If you're thinking of it in a play setting, because it's kind of laid out like that, this is your antagonist duo. And so as we go through that chapter, as we went through that chapter last week, what we noticed was this constant struggle between God's people who are remaining loyal to Him and thus being killed left and right by these two beasts, one which represents the devil himself and one which represents, or the emperor who serves the devil, and one which represents the priest, for lack of a better word, who facilitate the emperor worship, the worship of the Caesar that was going on in those days. So those who refused to worship the Caesar were being just gunned down or chopped down left and right and center. But those who were weaker, those many of whom were written to in the first couple of chapters, in Revelation chapters 2 and 3, who were weak and who were yielding, who were choosing to bow to the image of the Caesar, choosing to give up their life with Christ for a little bit longer stay on earth. Well, it is partly to them that a lot of chapter 14 is written, also partly to those who are organizing that worship, those who are receiving that worship, and then the great dragon who's behind it all. So everyone who is kind of an enemy of God is going to get a target put on them in chapter 14. And then after we finish chapter 14, which that'll probably be all that we'll do tonight, when we finish chapter 14, we're going to be so excited, we're going to be so happy, because as we end the chapter, we're going to realize that even though we've said it over and over, it's going to be reiterated for us that we win, that we have victory. That once God has defeated all of our enemies, some of whom are our brethren who made themselves the enemy of Christ, once He's defeated all enemies, all that will be left is Jesus and His people. And that's cause for celebration, and that's chapter 15, among other things. So that's what we're into right now. We're in Revelation chapter 14, and we're looking at this stirring of God to attack those who have made themselves His enemy. All right. Now, as we start the chapter, I just want to say one more time, remember how chapters 12 and 13 began. Chapter 12, I looked and I saw this scene in the constellations, among which was a great dragon. And then in the next chapter, chapter 13, I looked and I saw one beast rising from the sea, and then later another beast rising from the land. Now chapter 14 opens again with John seeing some grand thing. What does he see? I looked, and lo, verse 1, a lamb. Not a dragon, not a beast, not a terrible creature, but a lamb. And as a Christian, when I read this, I know who this lamb is right off the bat. It's the most number one easy to decipher apocalyptic term in the book. Who's the lamb? The lamb is the lamb. There's only one lamb for us. But he says, I looked, and behold, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his father's name, the King James says, written in their foreheads. You can take the entirety of chapter 14, which is only 20 verses long, and you can chop it into three disequal portions. The first 5 verses, victory of the Lamb. The next verses 6 through 13 represent the promises of the Lamb. And then the last portion of it, verses 14 through 20, the harvest of the Lamb. It begins here. It begins, though it's not obvious in verse 1, but it begins with a victory. I heard an old story, how a Savior came from glory, how he gave his life on Calvary to save a wretch like me. I heard about his groaning, of his precious blood's atoning, and I repented of my sins and won the victory. Oh, I'm going to keep going. Oh, victory in Jesus, my Savior forever. He sought me and bought me with his precious blood, redeeming blood. He loved me he loved me before I knew him, and all my love is due him. He plunged me to victory beneath the cleansing flood. That's the song of victory that we sing. You're going to hear that song in this chapter, but it's going to be sung through an apocalyptic lens. All right, so you're not going to hear the words, oh, victory in Jesus, blah, blah, blah. But you're going to hear that idea. You're going to get that vibe through this apocalyptic language. As I say, in the previous chapter, you had these beasts that rose up, these beasts that stirred to make havoc of God's people. Well, here, after things look bleak, after it looks like the promise of salvation is going to come to naught, after it looks like we're all going to be doomed, victory. The Lamb of victory makes his appearance. Lesson to learn before we move on to verse 2. Things may look bleak. Things may seem hopeless. Things may feel out of sorts. But that's probably because your perspective is here, when it ought to be angled a little bit more upward. Because John does not see victory in front of him. He sees victory above him. I saw standing on the mountaintop. He's got to look up to see that. Standing on Mount Zion, I saw the Lamb. And he was with whom? The 144,000. We already learned about these people in Revelation chapter 7. This is a number representing the faithful of God who remain. This 144,000, 7 verse 4 if you want the reference. This reference to those who are part of God's kingdom. And how does he describe them in this text beyond just the number? He says these are those who have the Father's name written. The King James says in, but it's the Greek word epi, which means upon. The name of the Father has been put on their foreheads, which someone's going to say, is that literal? Are there literally people with things written on their foreheads? No, this is not literal. Number one, we're going to come back to that. We're going to see how many times we ask that question in this chapter. No, it is not literal. However, it could be that John, as is in so much of Revelation, is using real-world applications to build this apocalyptic narrative. The Jews would sometimes, especially in the olden days, in fact, I think you can still see them, very, very Orthodox Jews today do this. They would wear flackelteries. Is anyone familiar with that word? It's basically a little bitty box that they would tie to their head that has a little piece of scripture written on it. Because they would take literally the commandment of God to put the word of God on your foreheads. Write them on your hearts, the doorposts of your home, all that, from Deuteronomy 6 and other places. And they would take that so hyper literally, they would actually physically do that, and they would walk around with these things on their heads like this. For a short period of time, during certain weeks, you'd see it a lot more often than others. But the Pharisees, they'd walk around, and they'd have the most massive ones. They'd have tassels, they'd have Christmas lights. They had arrows pointing at them that said, righteous, righteous, look at this dude. They wanted to make sure they had the biggest and boldest flackelteries. And Jesus mocks that in his ministry, as he mocks so many things of the Pharisees. So it could be a usage of that idea of taking it and just kind of removing it from its literalism and saying, look, God's people are a people who have his name imprinted on who they are. It's written on their forehead. Not literally, but it's written onto their mind, written onto their heart, which is what the mind is. As a man thinks in his heart, so is he. What comes from the heart is what he speaks, Jesus says. So written on your mind, the covenant of God, according to Jeremiah, is written on the hearts and minds of his people, not in tablets of stone. That idea, that's the 144,000. It's the people to whom God has put his stamp on their mind. Verse 2. And I heard a voice from heaven. As the voice, if you're just joining us, I already said I have a voice that's not like a voice from heaven. It's not going to sound anything like we're going to read here. So I may sound like I'm going through puberty, but it's just because my voice is going out a little bit. All right, verse 2. I heard a voice from heaven as the voice of many waters, as the voice of a great thunder. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. The voice of God is loud. This is actually the second time in this book. You got to go all the way back to the very beginning when John was first describing the sound that he heard when he heard God speak. And he described it then as he does here. It's the sound of like a rushing waterfall. If you've ever stood next to a waterfall, the sound of it is like the sound of a train just rolling by you. It's just loud, thunderous thing. And in the midst of all that, what else does he describe? I hear this voice from heaven, the voice of many waters, and as the voice of great thunder. This is the kind of window rattling, wake you up in the middle of the night tremor that is the only way he could think to describe how personally terrifying, how personally awe-inspiring it is to hear the booming voice of God. And I heard the voice of harpers harping with their harps. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard a harp. It's really hard to get those suckers loud. So anybody who says to me, so is this literal? Are there really going to be literal harps? Are we really going to be playing harps in heaven like the little naked babies with the wings that we have in our bathroom pictures? Or is that how it really is going to be? We're playing harps in heaven? Listen, if this is literal, which it's not because nothing else is, so why would this be? If this is literal, how is John even hearing these harps? Because he's got the whooshing of the waterfall. I don't think heaven is literally going to be you standing next to a waterfall or standing in front of a voice that's as loud as a waterfall with harpers harping in the background. I don't think that's literal. So why would you just cut that section out and say that one's literal and to run with it? Because that's literal, therefore we should be playing harps when we sing, which none of those people who say that think we should play harps. They prefer someone else on the stage playing a piano and us not playing anything. But if we're going to be technical, we'd all have to be playing harps. Which, I mean, you know how much harps cost? No. So no, don't take this literally. This is not literally. What John is hearing is a serenity sound. He is hearing the calming sounds which a harp playing brings. He's hearing people who are no longer restless, people who are no longer anxious, people who, despite being in the presence of a voice that rattles John to the core and is so loud it's only described like thunder and waterfalls, everybody else is just chill. And who are these people? These are the people who've won their victory, who are no longer fretting, no longer worried, no longer anxious, no longer stressed about all the trouble the world had previously brought them. This is your window into the serenity of victory. Verse 3, and they sung, as it were, a new song before the throne, and before the four beasts and the elders, and no man could learn that song except for the 144,000 which were redeemed from the earth. Who is the they in this verse? It says in the beginning of the verse, and they sung a new song before the throne. Who's the they? You might think it's the harpers from verse 2, but they're not the ones singing. They're playing the harpers, so that disqualifies them. They're playing the harps, so that disqualifies them. So it must be the 144,000. That's the only other group of people who could be singing that's provided for us in this context. In other words, John hears the voice of God. He hears harpers harping with harps, and he hears the redeemed. He hears the victors. He hears saints who have achieved their victory singing a song of praise, a new song of their salvation. Now, just follow my logic here, because I'm addressing this idea that people say when they take from Revelation, because it says this and that in Revelation, therefore we ought to worship God with mechanical instruments like a harp or something else. Okay, but in this text, it's not the Christians who are playing the harp. There's God who's making a big, loud, booming voice, skip a bit, and then at the end of it, you have all these Christians, the 144K, who are singing. So who's in the middle? Who's left in heaven? It's not the four beasts. It's not the elders. Who is it? Who's playing the harps? It must be the angels, which despite the common misconception, you don't die and become an angel. So this ain't talking about you. Either way, it's not literal. I won't mark it because I said that, not them. All right? So no, that's not what that is. It's the Christians, the 144,000, those who belong to the victory celebration, who are singing this celebration song. The angels can have their harps. The angels can play. If that's how God wants them to do their thing in heaven, fine. But according to this, if we were to take it literally, which we shouldn't because it's not, it's us who are singing victory in Jesus. Let the angels harp whatever they want to harp. Verse 4, who are these 144,000? Who are these people we're talking about? Verse 4, these are they which were not defiled with women, for they are virgins, the King James says. These are they which follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These are the redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. Now, just let's get the big picture and then zoom in. Big picture, it's pretty obvious, I think, who we're talking about here. We're talking about Christians. We're talking about saved people. And that's how they're described in these broad terms that we can understand in broad strokes. If nothing else, that one kind of there toward the end, the redeemed from among men, very clearly refers to God's saved people. So we're talking about Christians here. Now let's zoom in a little bit and notice how these Christians are described for us. They are not defiled with women because they're virgins. That doesn't mean only virgins go to heaven. That's not what that means. This is a figurative expression. It means those who are spiritually chaste, those who are spiritually pure, those who have not defiled their souls, corrupted their souls with sinful adultery of the spiritual kind. James chapter 1. Next, he says they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. And the Lamb does not lead them down the path of temptation. He leads them out of that path. Lead me not into temptation. Lead me away from that, good shepherd. So they follow the Lamb as sheep follow a shepherd. But he is a sheep because he's the Lamb of God. But we're like a lamb to his shepherding. Right? Everyone follow that? Good. So we're following him wherever he goes. Well, where is he taking us? Well, where are they? They followed him all the way to victory. I'll follow him the same path. They are the redeemed from among men, rescued from the fate that awaits what's coming in this chapter later. They are the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. Now, this is an interesting one. There's a couple of different possible applications. In fact, the New Testament uses the phrase first fruits in a spiritual context in a couple of different ways. And so it's a little bit trial and error, a little bit, do I put this puzzle piece this way or that to figure out which one it is. The phrase could refer to the first converts of Christianity. That's one way the Bible uses the phrase. Romans 16, verse 5. The first fruits are those who are first saved. In which case, these are those who are the first ones who've lived for Jesus, followed Jesus, and died for Jesus, and they are the template for all who would come after. That application, that puzzle piece, fits. All right? But, this one could also fit, because it could also refer to those who have been resurrected by Jesus. Because that's another way the phrase is used in 1 Corinthians 15. The first fruits, Jesus is the first fruits of them that slept. In fact, that might be 1 Corinthians 15:20. Jesus rose from the dead, never to die again, and he became the first fruits of those who would also rise from the dead. So these are those people who were persecuted, who lost their lives, but God just got them right back up. In other words, you can't let death stop you, because I'll undead you. I'll bring you back to life. So it could refer to either one, but you know what? Here's the great thing about this, and it kind of ruins the puzzle piece metaphor that I keep using, is that either one works, and it just kind of stops right there. So you're not going to get the butterfly effect of, I said it meant this, and it's going to ruin it in 3 chapters. No, it's either one, because we know the big picture. It's referring to God's people. So he's either talking about the first converts to Christianity, or he's talking about the kinds of people who will rise through Jesus Christ, either spiritual resurrection, salvation, or eternal resurrection after. Verse 5. And in their mouth, he's still describing the Christians of this text. In their mouth was found no guile. The King James says. Your Bible might say deceit or dishonesty, something like that. For they are without fault before the throne of God. In their mouth was found no guile literally just means these were honest people. These were people who would tell the truth. These are people who say what was. Who say what was, right? These people will not lie to you. They will not deceive you. They will not hem and haw and beat around the bush. They'll just tell you as it is, and what it will be the truth. Now that's general, but in the context, we just got through reading about the emperor worship scenario, where the people were told, you must confess Caesar as God, and those who did not die. And there were Christians who did confess Caesar, and from their mouth they spoke untruth. From their mouth they spoke that which was not. From their mouth they lied. They said someone was God who was not God. Who is God and who is not an opinion. You don't get to decide, well, this person is God to me. No, God is God. You might worship a false God, but that adjective is still there whether you acknowledge it or not. So those people lied. They said who God was, who was not God. But these people spoke no guile. They said who God was, and they said who was not God. God, not Caesar. And so they died. And because of that, because they were martyrs to the end, there was found no fault in them. That doesn't mean they were forever sinless like Jesus Christ. Never made a mistake ever. No, it means they were, the same word, blameless. Your Bible might even say blameless. It means they were washed from their sins, covered in the blood, walked in the light, faithful to the end. Doesn't mean they never made a mistake. It means they were justified from their mistakes because they were righteous in the sight of God. So it's a legal, judicial term. The judge looked at them and said, "Not guilty, by reason of my son." Verse 6. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. There's a little bit more in the next verses, but just start there in verse number 6. This actually begins the second part of the chapter, the promises of the Lamb. You have all these angels flying around. I mean, in just a couple of verses ago, let's see, it was in verse 3, if you go back there, the four beasts, the elders, that takes you all the way back to the very beginning of this book, when he first goes up and sees the whole spectacle of the throne, and the four beasts surrounding it, and all the elders with their crowns. John's taking you all the way back there, so it's hard for us sometimes to keep our characters straight in this play, but imagine John, there's angels flying all over the place. Some have trumpets, some are going to have these big walks, essentially. Some have all these different things, and all these things are happening. There's all these sounds. There's a big giant dude who's standing on the land and the sea. All this is going on, and yet he's able to distinguish, okay, this is a new angel. I haven't seen this one before, because that's verse number 6. I see this other angel, this new to the scene angel, flying in the midst of heaven, and he's got something that he's carrying. He's carrying the everlasting gospel. Now, the way it's phrased in the King James, I don't know how it's phrased in yours, but mine says it like this: having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth. The way it's phrased makes it sound like the angel is going to do the preaching, but he's not. He's carrying the message that is meant to be preached. He's carrying it to deliver it to those who will preach it. Angels don't preach the gospel. That principle is established for us, among other texts. Acts 10, verse 5. The angel that goes to visit Cornelius could have preached to him the gospel, but instead says, go call for Peter. Go call for the preacher to tell you the message. Angels don't preach the gospel. So this angel is not delivering to preach the gospel. He's delivering the gospel for someone else to preach. We'll get back to that. And what about this gospel? It's preached to, whenever it is preached, those that dwell on the earth, to every nation and kindred and tongue and people. The gospel is not national. The gospel is not regional. It is not cultural. It is not racial. It is universal. The language in which we deliver it changes. The culture of the people who receive it are different from our culture, and it kind of, wades out a lot of the filler and the fluff and the superfluous stuff that we sometimes gravitate and latch onto Christianity, and we kind of stick our own cultures onto there, and then you go take the gospel somewhere else, and you realize just how much of the Christian message is me and not Jesus. That's the gospel, the core, pure message of Jesus, death, burial, resurrection, and expectation for you. That's there. That's what he's delivering to all these people. Now, the Mormons say this angel is Moroni. Now, I don't know how they say that, because the word Moroni is not mentioned here, but it's in one of their books. It's just not in John's book, and his is inspired. So this angel's not given a name. It's not the job of an angel to make himself visible and to make himself known. This is just an angel. And it's odd to me that the Mormons will use this verse and say, look, this is Moroni come to deliver the second gospel to Joseph Smith or whomever. But if you keep reading, like literally right after this, other angels come doing the exact same work of this one. So why they singled this one out, I don't know. But that's what they say. We'll come back to the Mormons in a sec. Verse 7. This angel says with a loud voice, fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. And worship him that made heaven and earth and sea and the fountains of waters. I don't know if it's intentional, but whenever I read this text, as I studied it and I've reread it over and over, I'm just seeing this implicit contrast between God and Caesar, between the one who deserves your worship as God and the one who is demanding your worship, though he's not a God, but he wants to think that he is, and he will kill you if you don't call him that. And how Caesar's resume is so non-existent compared to God's. Like the moment you start listing all the things that make God worthy of worship, you quickly realize, as will be said in chapter 15, why would we worship anyone else? Because it is only God who made heaven and earth, sky and ground, and sea under that, and all the fountains of waters. It's only God who made everything that could ever be and has ever been. God's the only one who's done that. What has Caesar ever made? He made God angry. That's all he's ever made. Don't be on Team Caesar. Follow Team God. He made the sky, heaven. He made the land, earth. He made the sea. He made the springs, the fountains. And he says all that to say this: that same God who is so humongous and so powerful has for you, enemies of God, an hour of judgment prepared. The hour of judgment is come. Now let's be careful not to read this as, we're prophesying the final day of all days. because this is about judgment against Rome. It is very much written in the same style of the Old Testament prophets, particularly Isaiah. And we'll even see a lot more of Isaiah in just a second. But particularly Isaiah, as he went through a huge chunk of the early part of his book, just listing off nation after nation after city-state after nation, and saying, you're going to be destroyed, and you're going to be destroyed, and you get destruction, and you get, like Oprah giving away cars. You're going to be blown up. We're going to be blown up. You're going to be blown up. You're all going to be destroyed. God has always used earth-shattering analogies to describe the end of a nation. Because to a citizen of that nation, your nation falls. I mean, that's all you've ever known for 99% of the people. So that's the meaning behind the grandiose nature of the language. So that one angel comes. Verse 8. And there followed another angel, saying, Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Listen, if I'm Babylon, which, is this literally Babylon? No, stop asking that. Why would this suddenly be literal Babylon? Who is Babylon in the book of Revelation? Who is the big, scary empire that's conquered God's people in Revelation? The Roman Empire. But he's not going to say Rome, he's going to call them Babylon. So, if I'm Babylon, I read this, that's a sad thing. That's a scary thing. That's a word of my doom. But if I'm a Christian and I read this is not doom to me. This is a promise. This is hope. This is the assurance of victory. This is good news. This is another angel with good news. Now, the Mormons don't call this one, not Moroni, idiotai, or whatever they would say. But he's doing the exact same job as the other ones. There's no reason to single out the previous guy. So one had everlasting good news, and one has specific to Rome and to those who don't like him, good news. And what does he say about it? He says, Babylon is fallen. Sounds very similar to Jeremiah's writings. Babylon is fallen, the great city, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. She was wicked. She was debauched. She spread her tentacles of sin across the known world, and she forced everyone by penalty of legal death to submit to her sinfulness. And God will not let that stand. Now, He might let it stand for the very small window of time you call life on earth. And you might think, why has God not done anything about it? And then you die after 70 years, which is like a gnat's blink to God. And so we can lose perspective, but God will do something. Judgment will come to Rome, as it came to literal Babylon, very slowly and then suddenly all at once. So too it will come for Rome. Verse 9. Oh, just one more thing. The connection to Babylon, one more time. What happened to Babylon? Where is Babylon today? I mean, Iraq doesn't call themselves Babylon. Where is Babylon? It's in the history books. It's ashes. That's what happens when you go up against God. Where is Rome today? Italy doesn't call themselves the Roman Empire. Where is Rome today? Ashes. In the history books. Where is God today? Same chair He's always been sitting in. Right? Hit your wagon to the right horse. Verse 9. And a third angel followed him. Ignoranti, we'll say. A third angel comes and flies into view, saying with a loud voice, quote, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receives the mark in his forehead or his hand, let's keep going, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture or dilution, into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. That's a big sentence. Back up to verse number 9. This third angel flies into view. The previous two brought different kinds of messages. The first, a promise of victory for those who worship God. The second, a promise of doom for the empire that puts itself at odds with God. This angel, a promise of punishment, not for God's faithful, He wouldn't punish them, not for the evil empire, not comprised of any Christians. He's already punished them in this context. So who's left to be punished but God's people who have left God? God's people who have taken up with this empire. Well, shouldn't they be slotted in with the empire? When the empire falls, shouldn't they fall with it? Well, that's kind of a Hollywood ending. It's your baby, you rock it, as Elvis said. That's your bed, you lie in it. So when the walls, metaphorically speaking, crumble, it's going to crumble on those people who decided to take up in league with Babylon. But with God, He's more specific. He's more targeted. He's more zeroing in. So He's going to take care of His people. He's going to destroy this evil empire. And then He's going to have a special punishment for His people who got in league with this evil empire, who yielded to the temptation to praise Caesar over God, who gave up their rights and privileges as God's children to be a child of Caesar and to call Him God. These are the people who go back to the muck and the mire, as Peter talked about. And a worse fate awaits them than the others. If any man worship the beast and his image. You don't need to tell Romans that. They're already doing it. It's the Christians who are being tempted to do it that need to hear this warning. Verse 9. If anyone worship the beast and his image and receive the mark of the beast we talked about last week, in his forehead or in his hand, that one shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God. And the illustration is God has this cup, and every time you spit in his face, every time you blaspheme him, every time a nation does evil against him, a little bit of wine, the wine of his rage, goes into that cup. I mean, just think of it like, and a little bit goes in, a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit, until eventually what happens? It spills over. That is the cup of his wrath. Now we sing hymns about the cup of his joy and the cup of my joy. Oh, my cup runs over, we say. My cup of joy runs over. What a wonderful thing. That's great and good, but God has a cup of wrath too. And in Rome, it is slowly, slowly, slowly reaching the top. And then it's going to spill over. And in this case, to those Christians who got in bed with Rome. The wine of his wrath, which is going to be poured out without mixture, the King James says, unwatered down, unfiltered wine. I'm not an alcoholic, so I forget. Is it 0 proof that's pure alcohol, or 100 proof that's pure alcohol? 100, yeah. So what do you call it when there's some non-alcohol? What's the term? Is it diluted? Is that all you say? I don't drink, people. All right. That's what he's saying. It's pure. It's undiluted. 100%, 100 proof. All right. Now I'm out of my element, so let's get back in the Bible. It's going to be poured out without dilution into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented, he being these Christians who've gotten in bed with Caesar, shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. Don't read this as final judgment. I mean, that's the ultimate end for all people who have sided against God, yes. But this is strictly in the context of God bringing his hammer down on Rome. And what will happen after that is just the after effect. But keep the focus on Rome and what's coming to them. Verse 11. And the smoke of their torment ascends up forever and ever. And they have no rest day or night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receives the mark of his name. Again, contrast this with Christianity, who are also described in this chapter as getting a mark on their forehead, except theirs is a mark that comes from God, the one true God, the one that says, this belongs to a covenant with me, this one does. Those who get the other mark, the mark of the beast, the mark that says, this one's in league with Caesar, this one worships Caesar, this one thinks Caesar is God. What happens to them? They suffer. And the smoke of their torment, they're burning, and things that burn give up smoke. And the smoke of their being in torment will bloom up forever and ever. And they will have no rest day or night. There are people who will teach that hell does not exist and that there is just annihilation. That when your soul, which was made by God, is judged and found guilty at the final day, it just ceases to be and no longer is. You have no thought, no consciousness, no concept that you are not in the presence of God. You simply do not exist anymore. And yet this says forever and ever and ever. Now you say, well, is that you taking it literally? Well, this is not apocalyptic here. The smoke and the angel and all that stuff is describing what is happening, and he's using these words to tell you how long it will happen, but there's no indication of apocalypse in this text, in this section of it. This is just a term. This is just a phrase that people would know. How long does this apocalyptic thing last? Forever. What does the apocalyptic thing refer to? The suffering of those who have gone away from God will last forever. For whom? For those who say, Hail Caesar. That's the mark of the beast, as opposed to those who say, Praise God. One of those will have a comfortable life on earth, and then they will die, and they will suffer forever. The other one will have a miserable, painful, persecuted life for a very short time, and then they'll die, and they'll have victory forever. Now, it's getting people to see beyond that wall, beyond that veil of life, to see the forever on the other side. That's the struggle of preachers and Christians, to get our neighbors to see that. But that's what's on the other side, forever, one way or the other. Verse 12. Here is the patience of the saints. Let me pause before I finish the verse. Whenever your Bible, and this the way it's written here, whenever it says, here is this, it's not so much looking forward as it is looking backward, and this is the conclusion. All that has been said leads me to say, this is what patience looks like. That's what he's saying here. Verse 12, here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God. It's like he's presenting them for the reader to observe, for me to observe, so I can see who is on which side and how they got on those two sides, one in victory forever, one in punishment forever, and to know which team I want to be on. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and keep the faith of Jesus Christ. Faithfulness, fidelity, loyalty is the hallmark of Christianity. It is the one thing that kind of trickles down to everything. If you love God more than anything else, you'll be faithful to Him more than anything else. So if you can just nail that, everything else falls into place. We get too bogged down, how do I deal with this problem? How do I deal with this persecution? How do I deal with this prosecution of the government against me, the empire bearing down on me? But just zoom out and see the big picture. I have victory in my hands. It's not going to be in my hands. It's not going to be given to me. It's mine right now. I have victory. I have the ball. Now I can drop the ball and put my hands up and say, please don't kill me. I don't want to die. And they'll kill me eventually, or age will take me one. But if I just hold on to the ball, yes, they may kill me, but I have my victory in death, which leads to victory in life. So keep the faith of Jesus, even if it kills you. Verse 13. And I heard a voice from heaven saying unto me, Write, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Just a second. Okay. Verse 13, sorry. I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, Write, blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, says the Spirit, they may rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Not all Christians abandoned the faith. Not all Christians gave up. Don't read this chapter and say, oh, how miserable, how depressing is this chapter, because there is positivity in this chapter. This chapter began with your hero arriving on the scene, and he's got more to do in a second. But he says to those who died faithful, those who die unfaithful, torment, smoke billows forever. Those who die faithful are blessed. Who died in the Lord are blessed from henceforth. Now that's not me doing this, that is John, inspired by God, doing this, linking the eternality of blessing forevermore with the eternality of torment forevermore. So if you're going to come at me and say that hell is not eternal, according to Revelation, it's as eternal as heaven is. So are we all going to be extinguished, never to exist or have consciousness again? Or are we going to have eternity one way or the other? That's the message of Revelation. You're going to one of two places forevermore. In verse 13, it's about the faithful. Those who are blessed, who die in the Lord, are blessed from henceforth. Yea, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labors, and their works do follow them. Why are they here? Because they endured. Why are you here? How did you make it here? If we could interview the people who are in paradise now, what did you do to get here, sir? They would say to us, well, they persecuted me, but I didn't give up. I sinned a couple of times, but I always repented. And I stayed faithful to God even when it was hard. I stayed faithful to God when it was very easy to get complacent. I was faithful and I died faithful. And some will say I was old and I just passed away. And some will say it was brutal. You don't want to know the details. But all of them will say the same thing. I was faithful, then I died. That's how I got here. That's it. What's the secret to going to heaven? Be faithful till you die. That's it. It's not complicated. I mean, there's a whole book about why you need to be faithful. But the actual message is Revelation 2, verse 10, right there. And it's just one paragraph. Be faithful unto death. I'll give you the crown of life. That's it. I hear this voice saying, blessed by God are the dead killed by Satan, who die in the Lord. They've been put into Christ and remain faithful in that state. From henceforth, evermore blessed. And they rest in God's bosom in the paradise of God with Christ. From their labors, they worked for Jesus on earth. Now they rest with Jesus in the eternal Sabbath, and their works do follow them. That doesn't mean their works earned them salvation. That's their way of saying, this is what I did. This is how I got here. I didn't earn it, but I was told to do these things. Instead of doing those evil things, I did these good things. And God gave me something I didn't deserve. Verse 14. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud. And upon the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head, a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp. Does your Bible say sickle? Okay, it's you know what that is. It's the reaper's thing. Almost called it a sword. It's not quite a sword. It's more of an axe than anything. You know what it is? It's a sickle. All right. What does he say? I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud sat one like the Son of Man. Behold, he comes riding on the clouds. a song which we often associate with the second coming. Well, if that text is meant to be taken from Revelation, this is not about the second coming. It's about Jesus riding a cavalry of clouds to bring judgment against Rome. Upon the clouds sat the Son of Man, and he's got this golden crown on his head. Here's your emperor. Here's your king of all kings. And in his hand is the reaper's weapon. The reaper's tool, to be more precise. This is the third and final section beginning here. The description of Jesus coming in the clouds, very much lifted from Daniel chapter 7, except there he sees him as ascending into the clouds to take his place as the king over the kingdom. Here he is coming from the clouds to bring judgment to, in this context, Rome. And if you still want to look at this and say, well, this must be final judgment, this must be the end of all things, I would just point to you a couple of places in the Old Testament where judgment was described as the end of the world, but it was specified to a particular people. For example, Jude quotes from Enoch, who talked about the Lord coming with the 10,000 of his saints, Jude verse 14, and that he's talking about judgment against the enemies of that particular moment. Moses, though, said the exact same thing, used the exact same phraseology, Deuteronomy 33 verse 2, to reference those who would come against the nation of Israel. There is the book of Obadiah. I mean, the whole book of Obadiah is about the judgment against Edom and how God will bring judgment against Edom. And if you read that, and if I told you as you read Obadiah, and you can read that in 5 minutes, it's one chapter long. If I say, when you read this is all about the second coming of Christ, you would start seeing the references pop. But it's not about the second coming of Christ. It's about the judgment of God against the nation of Edom. It's just described as, this is the end of the world as you know it. And I feel fine, but you're not going to be fine because you're on the other side of God. That's the way it's written. And John simply lifts that phraseology here. And another angel came out of the temple. Who is this angel? What's his name? What's his quest? What's his favorite color? What is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? There's all these angels, and yet John is able to keep them all straight. I was just amazed by it as I read the chapter. Here comes another angel out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. It's very important that we keep all of our pronouns straight and we remember and keep in mind who is talking to whom. Okay? Look at it again. Premillennialists will argue, I didn't write down to make fun of them, but they're always fair game. Premillennialists argue that this text is a picture of the rapture. That Jesus, this is a picture of Jesus coming to reap, to collect harvest time, to harvest up his people and to take them home. He's going to gather all of his toys and leave all the bad toys at the house. That's what the rapture is to these people. That he's going to collect his people and leave the rest behind. But that's not how it's described if you go to this text. All right? So we'll keep reading and we'll see that as we go through it. Just want to plant that seed. This is a message of the people who are specifically being hurt by Rome. It's not going to be much help to them if it's about something that will happen thousands of years later. How does this help them? It's a reminder to them that the God, the empire that's bearing down on you has spit in the face of, has blasphemed, that God is preparing to act. And he has got his sickle, and he is going to know who his people are and who his people are not. He's going to be able to separate, like wheat from chaff, his righteous from unrighteous. And he's going to do more than that. Look at the rest of the verse. Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. Specifically, he's going to be gathering up grapes. The grapes of wrath, we'll get to in just a second. But notice specifically what's being said here. Look at verse 15. Another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to the one who sat on the cloud. He's not crying to John. He's not crying to Rome. He's not crying to the earth. He is yelling at Jesus to do something. Angels are messengers of God, so this is an apocalyptic version of God saying, okay, Jesus, now is the time. We have been kind of hovering the anvil over Wile E. Coyote's head. That's Rome. It's now time to snip the rope and bring it down. Now is the time. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and all of the saints who have been waiting are waiting long enough. All the dead saints who have been waiting under the altar crying, how long, have waited long enough. Now it is the time for the reaper to reap. Verse 16. And he that sat on the cloud thrust in his sickle on the earth, and the earth was harvested. The earth was gathered up. The King James says the earth was reaped. What does your Bible say? Everyone's Bible says reap? R-E-A-P? All right. Who is going to execute the overthrowing of Rome? That's what this is about. Who is ultimately responsible for the empire's downfall. You can look through history and you can say, well, they were destabilized from within, and then they had a constant barrage of small invasions that they repelled, but with every repulsion, they were a little weaker. They were just crumbling on the inside, rotting, and on the outside, their outer defenses were weakening, and their territory was shrinking, and their walls were closing in, the ground was collapsing under their feet, and you can identify all these earthly markers. But John just says, hey, Christians, zoom out. Let's remember who put Roman power in the first place. According to Daniel chapter 4, it was God. And so if Rome is collapsing, it is because of God. So if God is doing this, whose side should you be on? But God's. It is in God's purview to give and take away the power of empires. Daniel 4:17. He's the one who's sitting on the cloud. He's the one who's going to be reaping. Verse 17. And another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, having a sharp sickle. Now this angel has a sickle in his hand. The Son of Man, God, Jesus, has a sickle. Here comes this other angel. If you're keeping score, and I don't know how you could possibly be doing so, this is the fifth angel we've met in this chapter. The first one told us of everlasting good news, or brought the message of everlasting good news, verse 6. The second one gave us the word of woe, Babylon is fallen, promise of destruction for the empire. The third one warned us not to fall in with the worship of the emperor, or we'll suffer a horrible fate. The fourth one was sent from the temple to tell the Son of Man to begin his harvest. That was verse 15. And this one, the fifth angel, comes out of the temple, and he's carrying his own sharp sickle. To come out of the temple seems to me is an idea of leaving the presence of God from heaven to earth. The temple in Revelation is where God is. So leaving the temple is leaving God's presence to go to this wicked and evil place where punishment must be carried out. All of heaven is invested in this. I mean, this is a play that it's got a packed house of people watching it. We've been introduced to many of them. You have all these elders over here, and you have all these angels over here. The whole chorus of heaven at one point. The constellations are taking apart. All of creation is involved in the struggle for your salvation. And when we get to the Battle of Armageddon, you're going to see just how personal that idea, that phrase is in a few chapters. Look at verse 18. And another angel came out of the altar, which had the power over fire, and cried with a loud voice, this angel did, cried to him that had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in the sharp sickle, and gather the clusters of the vine for the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. Sixth angel mentioned here. And this is the last one mentioned in this context, which if you're like me, and you've been reading about 7 this and 7 that, and 7 angels here and 7 angels there, suddenly you get to one and there's only 6, you're thinking, where is the 7th angel? There ought to be 7 angels. And I count and I recount, and there's only 6. Yes, there are only 6, when there's usually 7 in these sort of things. There's 6 plus Jesus. Now, Jesus ain't an angel, but he's the captain of the guard in this case. This is the cavalry of your redemption. And there are 6 angels, 3 on each side as I visualize it, flanking him as he's riding the clouds in with the sickle. So again, verse 18. This angel comes out of the altar, having the power over fire, and cried, and I have no idea what that means. Purification? I have no idea. Keep rolling. And cried at power of fire, and cried with a loud voice to him with the sharp sickle. I take that to mean the angel, not the Son of Man, the previously mentioned one with the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in the sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. What does this have to do with anything? Why are we talking about harvesting grapes? You've got to remember, we have a cup of wrath, a wine cup. Well, how does one make wine but with grapes? The grapes of God's wrath. Not the big, ginormous book, The Grapes of Wrath, but the Isaiah 63 reference, which became the battle hymn of the Republic. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vineyard where the grapes of wrath are stored. We're going to see that here. Keep reading. Verse 19. And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. I mean, it could so easily, an editor could come in and just snip like 6 verses and say, cut to the chase. He's got the cup of wrath, and he's pouring out the wine. But he just brings you into the moment, and he builds the suspense of the reaping of the grapes and the putting them in the wine press and then the stamping out of the grapes to get the wine press ready, wine pressed and ready to be poured out. It's building the anticipation, building the suspense in these verses that seem like they're so irrelevant, but they're not. It's part of the whole vibe. Again, 19. The angel thrusts his sickle to the earth and gathers the vine of the earth and casts it to the winepress of the wrath of God. Verse 20. And the winepress was trodden Like you see the French people, with the cigarette, and they're stomping, their legs are all purple because they're stomping grapes. That's this. Except who is doing the stomping? Who is pressing? Who is preparing? Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He, you can't use doctrine from a song, but that's what I think of. He is trampling out the vineyard where the grapes of wrath are stored. The winepress was trodden. The King James says without the city, means outside of the city, separate from the city. And the blood came out of the winepress, even to the horses' bridles, by the space of 1,600 furlongs. Furlong, that's total about 200 miles. So John's eyes have seen the glory of the coming of God's vengeance. And John has seen the Lord stamping out his winepress of rage. He has seen him, and you can almost imagine, I picture, and fittingly, it's John, who in another lifetime, a long time ago, John watched his master in the temple, John chapter 2, and before he crucified as well. And he saw his master watch the money changers. And he watched his master just calmly walk over to where these money changers were extorting their people. Exchanging the money for an exorbitant price, overcharging it so the people could buy the offerings they want to give, because they had already established the rule you can't bring your own offerings to Jerusalem. You got to buy house offerings. So you got to play with house money. You can't have your Roman money here. Your Roman money is filthy. We'll give you this Jewish money that will mark up for a high price. Corruption on the inside is okay, just not on the outside. So they're extorting the people, and the master's watching it. And he's seeing the corruption. He's seeing it in a way you can't see it with human eyes. He's seeing it from a divine perspective. And he just moseys over, and he just takes a rope, starts twisting it into a whip, and then he just goes off. And he flips the table, and he cracks the whip, and I would scream, but my voice, and he forces them out. And John saw the rage, the divine, righteous indignation on the face of the meek and mild Son of Man. He saw the reaction to sin in a physical form that God has. And now that same John is watching, and he first sees the Master riding in on a cloud, pure, white. His robes are sparkling. And he's got a sickle. And they're reaping for him, and he's reaping, and all these grapes are there, and now he is staining his robe red. Not with wine, but with the blood of his enemies. That's Isaiah 63, incidentally. Isaiah says, I saw a dude covered in blood. Read the chapter. I saw a guy covered head to toe. His robes were scarlet, drenched in the blood of his enemies. He saw the Lord covered in the blood of his enemies. You do not want to be on that side. That's this verse right here. The winepress was trodden. He was stamping. And again, I'm becoming old. I trail off and I forget my point. That's my point. John saw in his master's eyes in John 2 that face as he snorted like a bull is what the word means. He grew with anger. He's psyching himself up. He's about to flip a table. That's what he looks like. He looks like a bull about to charge in John 2. And now John sees that same expression on him in an apocalyptic viewpoint. He's stomping these grapes, preparing to unleash his wrath. And when he does, the blood flows out of the winepress. And it flows so high it goes up to the horses' bridles in their mouth. You can't get a horse across a stream that tall. They'll go to about here or so, but then they won't walk anymore. After a certain point, a horse won't go that far. The blood rises so far, it goes up to the horses here. That's how much blood is rolling in the streets of Rome. And it's a river of blood 200 miles long. That's the chapter. It's a victory chapter if you're on his side. Now, if you're on the other side and you're seeing what John sees, which you're free to read the book, Enemy of God. You're free to read the recipe for your own undoing. By all means, read it. Let it motivate you to change. But if you read this book, Enemy of God, you're seeing what John saw. You're seeing snorting rage of a divine being stamping out the grapes of wrath against you. It's like seeing the executioner just staring at you as he's sharpening the sword. It's a power, it's a boss move. And so you're seeing in his eyes the rage he feels for you if you're not his enemy. And if you're not his enemy, if you are his enemy, if you're not his enemy, you're on this side of him looking at him going, I'm glad I'm on this side. I'm glad I'm not standing over there where he's about to charge like a bull. I'm glad I'm on the Lord's side. Otherwise, I would be utterly destroyed. That's the takeaway. And as the chapter ends, and you start the next chapter, which we're going to stop here 5 minutes early. Look at the next verse 1 of chapter 15. After all that, blood in the streets, 200 miles long, I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, humongous and awe-inspiring. And they're going to sing a song as these bowls are going to be poured out of wrath and rage against Rome. That's Revelation chapter 15. I may or may not have said Romans more than once. I'm sure I did in this class. Any comments or questions from the text that we studied tonight, Revelation chapter 14? All right. That's all I have for you guys. You're dismissed.